Now the second exercise. I want you to build an endpoint to manage the customers. And this is the shape of our customer objects. So each customer has three properties: isGold, which is a Boolean, name, and phone, which are strings. Of course, in a real world application, we could have 10 other properties. That doesn't really change the big picture. So go ahead, do this exercise, and when you're done, come back, continue watching. All right, now my solution. So here in the routes folder, I'm going to add a new file, customers.js. So in this module, we're going to implement all the routes for working with customers. Now in index.js, just like how we loaded the genres module, we need to load the customers module. So constant customers, we set this to require /routes/customers. Okay. And then we tell Express that wherever you have a route that starts with /API/customers, you need to delegate the handling of those routes to this customers router that we get from this module. So app.use /API/customers, we delegate it to customers router. So we can see with the current structure, we don't pollute index.js with all the details of various routes in our application. We are encapsulating the related routes inside modules. So in the customers module, we need similar code to what we have in genres module. So to save time, I'm going to go to genres.js, copy some code from here, and then modify it accordingly. So from the first line, I'm going to get all these require statements. I'm going to get the definition of this genre module, as well as two routes, get all and post. Now implementing the other routes is very similar. I'm not going to waste your time typing all this code by hand or modifying it. I'm just going to show you these two routes to make sure we're on the same page. So copy all this code back in customers module, paste it here, and then at the end, we need to export this router. So module.exports, we set it to this router object. All right, now let's go on the top and start modifying this code. So all our require statements stay the same. Now here we need to define a new model. We're going to rename this to customer. And of course, the name of our collection should be customer. So each customer should have three properties. We already have name. Now we add isGold, which should be a Boolean. So type is Boolean. And we can also set a default value here to false. And finally, phone. So to save time, I'm going to copy this block because that's very similar. And then change name to phone. I want to make this required because we should have a way to contact each customer. So you see, in this implementation, I'm defining a standard to work with strings. So all our strings here have a minimum length of 5 and a maximum length of 50. You might change this to 255 or whatever, but it's good to have a standard that you use everywhere so you don't have to guess what should be the minimum or maximum length of a given string. And then in a particular case, if you want to override that, then you go ahead and override those values. So here's our customer model. Now, our first route handler for getting all the customers. So this is how we get all the customers, exactly the same. We just need to rename this constant to customers. Done. Now the second route handler. So when posting a new customer, first we need to validate it. So we also need the code for this validate genre or validate customer function. I'm going to go back to our genres module. This function is at the end of this file. So, okay, here it is. Let's copy this and back in customers module, paste it here. Now we rename this to validate customer. We should also change the parameter name to customer. Now the schema we have here is a little bit inconsistent with what we defined for Mongoose. So we set minimum to 5 characters and maximum to 50 characters. Okay, so this is our name property that is required. We also need the same definition for the phone property. So phone. All right, now you may argue that here we have some kind of duplication because we have defined this schema, which is used purely for Joy, and we have defined another schema on the top, which is purely for Mongoose. That's a fair argument. But these two libraries have different APIs for defining a schema. In my opinion, there is really no point in refactoring this code and getting rid of this duplication because the validation requirements for these properties do not change that often. In other words, the name of a customer is always required. It's not something that 2 months later you decide to make it optional and then a month later you decide to make it required. So you have to change 2 different places in the code. The same applies to the length of a customer's name. So I personally don't worry too much about this duplication. All right, and finally we need another property in this schema that is gold, which we set to joy.boolean. Okay. All right, so we're done with this validate customer function. So back in this route handler, we validate the customer. If it's valid, we're going to save it to the database. So here we need to create a customer object, and let's rename this to customer. Here we need to add a couple more properties. So phone, which we set to request.body.phone, and is gold. Very similar. And then finally, we save the customer and return it to the client. So I leave it up to you to implement the other route handlers. You can find my completed solution attached to this lecture.